The history of the Jewish people began more than 3,000 years ago. In the desert, an idea developed of the one and only God, one who tolerates no other gods but him. Monotheism was an idea that would change the world. War and persecution scattered the Jews all around the world. It's a story of splendor and suffering that leads right up to the present day. They've left their mark as great thinkers, scientists and artists. How did the Jews manage to maintain their identity over all these years? The Jews, History of a People. Part 5, Zion. A man on the way up, Moses Mendelssohn, philosopher and Jew. He has studied the history of his people and wants to change its future. Mendelssohn is invited to Sans Souci, a Jew in the palace of the Prussian king Frederick the Great. What do you deal in, Jew? Something you don't have, reason. Moses Mendelssohn has made a name for himself as a philosopher of the Enlightenment and a worldly thinker. People are reading his writings not only in Germany but in the whole of Europe. It is thanks to this reputation that he was invited to Sans Souci. The Saxon Minister of State, Baron von Fritsch, admires him. He has come to Potsdam to debate with this famous Jew. Mendelssohn uses the interest taken by the statesman to state his political demands. Religious tolerance must be granted to everyone equally, including Jews and Muslims. Let us be human beings amongst human beings. We are entitled to the same rights and duties that any other citizen is entitled to. Baron von Fritsch sees in him the living proof for the fundamental idea of the Enlightenment. All human beings are able to liberate themselves from the shackles of their social circumstances. The meeting takes place right next door to the Prussian king, but he won't receive Jews. The king refuses to admit him into his Academy of Sciences, even though Prussia's greatest thinkers have unanimously voted him into their midst. This recognition is denied him because he is a Jew. Ambitious and thirsty for knowledge, Mendelssohn had left his parents' home in Dessau when he was only 14, so that he could follow his teacher to the Prussian capital, Berlin. He has to go around half the city in order to enter it because Jews are only allowed to enter through one particular city gate, the one which Christians use to get their livestock to market. It wasn't the only humiliation that awaited a Jew in Berlin. Prussia only accepts Jews if they can prove that they are wealthy or when they make themselves useful as merchants, moneylenders or physicians. Young Mendelssohn had nothing like that to offer, but he did have the guarantee of his teacher, a so-called protected Jew. With protection letters, Jews were able to buy themselves a limited right of residence and trade in Prussia, in return for a royal fee of 1,000 thalers, a fortune. At that time, 100,000 people lived in Berlin, and amongst them there were just 2,000 Jews. Even those who had managed to establish themselves here could still be banished at any time. In his kingdom, so said the Prussian king, everyone should find salvation in their own way. The exception, the Jewish citizens. Tolerance and fairness weren't for everyone. Most Jews withdrew and lived isolated from the Christian surroundings. They read in Hebrew and spoke Yiddish. Their right to trade is restricted. They're excluded from many professions. Those who are lucky find work in manufacturing businesses founded by a small group of wealthy Jews. Moses Mendelssohn also earns his family's living in a Jewish silk factory. As a bookkeeper, he balances the bills and checks the goods. He called this a tedious business that used up the best years of his life. Because he has other plans. As a follower of the Enlightenment, he wants to fight against the oppression of his fellow believers, but that is only possible if they open up and adapt to the society around them. Mendelssohn's ideas meet with great approval amongst many Jews. Mementos of him are still cherished today, like his protective goggles in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. At night, Mendelssohn works like mad on his own writings on religion and philosophy. He also acquires the secular knowledge rejected by the rabbis. Besides Latin, English and French, he also masters the language that hardly any Jew knows, German. Mendelssohn is the first to translate the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, into German. The text is printed in Hebrew letters because they were the only ones most Jews were able to read at that time. Mendelssohn had the purpose in mind to teach the German Jews the German language. That, of course, caused some strong reaction amongst some of the Orthodox rabbis. They said the Bible wasn't allowed to serve as a teaching tool for the German language. But many other German Jews applauded the idea because they did want to participate in German society. So they accepted his Bible translation and his philosophical writings with enthusiasm. Adaptation, yes, but the tradition of the faith had to remain the same. Firmly keeping to one's own religion and participating in the state's public life as a human being and citizen. Both were part of a person's identity, Mendelssohn said, to be an enlightened contemporary and a Jew. He himself was consciously living in 2 worlds. For the Jewish community, he was Moshe from Dessau. That's how his name was written in Yiddish. But in civic life, he remained Moses Mendelssohn. On his suggestion, the first free Jewish schools are created, accessible to every child at no charge, boys and girls. Christian and Jewish children are taught together. They don't just read religious texts. German, nature study and mathematics are all on the curriculum. Moses Mendelssohn is convinced that education is the only path that will lead out of the ghetto of isolation. These new schools that arose towards the end of the 18th century formed the institutional anchorage of the Enlightenment, as it were. Here, a new generation of German Jews developed that was meant to be at home in Jewish tradition, but also in the German language, culture, and the secular sciences. Mendelssohn's ideas also find recognition in the Christian spiritual world. Some even want to convert him to Christianity as a logical step in his career. Mendelssohn declines, but those who understood him that way misinterpreted him. He became the leader of the Jewish emancipation in the whole of Europe. He gave many Jews the self-confidence and strength to fight for their rights. And he was successful. Even in his lifetime, his demands were fixed by law, not in Prussia, but in Austria. The Tolerance Edict of 1781 puts into effect what Mendelssohn demanded as a human right. Jews were now equal citizens. Jews particularly used these chances in Czernowitzy on the eastern border of the Habsburg Empire. They helped build the town and assimilate to the German-speaking culture oriented towards Vienna. Around 1900, more than a third of the population was Jewish. A Jewish Nationalhaus, a kind of cultural centre, is the expression of the newly found self-confidence. The tombstones in the Jewish cemetery reflect the social advancement. Lawyers, bank directors and professors. There was even a Jewish mayor. And there was Yiddish, the very own language of the Eastern European Jews. The Czernowitzy Jews were vigorously demanding its official recognition. These days, only a few still keep Yiddish alive, such as the author Joseph Berg and the leader of the Jewish congregation. The ring of their voices is like a distant echo of a once rich Jewish culture in Eastern Europe.
Nazellige heb ik gezien zeer als zaak in verschillende steden.
Also in de vooraan, in die planetariën.
Ja. En ik heb geleerd in...
When I was studying at the university in Vienna, my professor asked me what my mother tongue was, and I answered him, Yiddish, sir. And I had expected that he would express that famous prejudice, the famous Yiddish is corrupt German, Yiddish is jargon.
Als bald werd zoekt, dus berimte in Jensenfiesler, dus berimte, Jiddisch is een verdorben Duits. Ja, der Jiddisch is een jargon.
But no, he said, Yiddish, young friend, is a loschen beazmoy. Yiddish, young friend, is an autonomous language.
Jiddisch, junger Freund, ist eine Sprache für sich.
Joseph Berg lives in the Jewish quarter of Czernowitzy. He remembers the more than 60 synagogues and houses of worship that used to be here. But little of this has survived National Socialism and communism. The Jews of Czernowitzy meet every morning for their service. Many that pray here have only managed to survive through happy coincidences. Not far from Czernowitzy, on the other side of the Dnieper River, the land used to be part of Russia. Here, the cold breath of the great, hostile Tsarist empire drifts across, wrote the Jewish author Joseph Roth. A different world on the distant riverbank, and also different conditions for Jews. At the end of the 18th century, the Tsar conquered large parts of Poland. That was where the majority of the Eastern European Jews were living. But the Tsar did not want them in his heartland, so he forbade the Jews to leave their living areas. Here, the author Mary Antin grew up towards the end of the 19th century before she emigrated to the United States with her family. In her books, she wrote about the everyday lives of Jews in the Tsarist Empire. I was a prisoner. The shackles had grown familiar to my flesh. Even as a young girl, she entrusted her diary with her experiences, fears, and hopes. Mary Antin's hometown of Polotsk lies in modern-day Lithuania. Jews were living amongst themselves here without rights, oppressed and often persecuted by their Christian neighbours. Time and again her parents warned Mary and her sisters to beware of the Christians. Christian holidays were particularly dangerous for Jews, Mary remembered. Passover was a time of horror for the Jews. Somebody would start up that lie about murdering Christian children, and the stupid peasants would get mad about it and fill themselves with vodka and set out to kill the Jews. They attacked them with knives and axes, killed them or tortured them and burned their houses. Again and again there were gruesome pogroms in the Tsarist Empire. This label for the anti-Jewish riots originated in Russia. The Gentiles were going to tear me in pieces with axes and knives and ropes. They were going to burn me alive. The cross, what would they do to me first? The Tsar was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. As protector of the true Christian faith, he was openly hostile towards Judaism. For the solution of the Jewish question, a rule of thumb was proposed. A third of Jews should convert, another third should emigrate, and the final third should starve. In the mid-19th century, 5 million Jews were living in the area assigned to them. Pent up like in a huge ghetto, they banded together in their own villages and neighborhoods. Just as in Letichev in modern-day Ukraine, only the old remember that until the 1940s nearly all the inhabitants were Jewish. In Yiddish, the Jews called their neighborhoods shtetl, little towns, small islands in an ocean of followers of a different religion. Jews were not allowed to work as peasants in the Tsarist Empire, but they were allowed to be craftsmen. Because more and more people moved into a shtetl, every village had 10 coppersmiths, cobblers or tailors. But despite the poverty and the lack of space, the external threat was unifying. To this day, a survivor of the shtetl is living on the outskirts of Letichev. 96-year-old Babushka Polya. It's Friday evening. The Sabbath celebration begins at dusk. After an old Jewish custom, Baba Polya asks for God's blessing for her family.
Спичку ложи. Ну, молиться. Готуню, дай Бог, щоб все были здоровы, щоб мы собрались.
Like countless generations of women before her, she's celebrating at home with her family. God's gifts, bread and wine. Never mind how lavish or meagre life may be, there is always reason for thankfulness. In the historical archive of Kamenets-Podolsky in modern-day Ukraine, mounds of manuscripts document the anti-Jewish laws of the Tsars. Since the end of Soviet times, a start has been made on evaluating them. One law was particularly inhumane. It forced Jewish boys to serve in the army. The military lists document that even 14 and 15-year-olds were conscripted. Under some Tsars, they had to serve for 25 years. The Jewish communities had to organize the recruitment themselves. Some sent out kappa, kidnappers. The parents knew that hell awaited their sons, and if they were to ever see them again, then only as strangers who no longer knew or understood their Jewish home anymore. For 300 rubles, the parents could ransom the little recruits, a fortune. Some families pawned their livestock or even their home and farm. Parents who couldn't afford that went to the extreme limits of the imaginable. They mutilated their sons, cut off their fingers and toes in order to save them from the Tsar's army. They did all that to prevent their children being alienated from their Jewish faith and their culture with brutal violence. Thus, the Jews in the Tsarist Empire experienced oppression and suffering right from their childhood. Only their faith provided support and comfort. In moments when their wretchedness was greatest, it wakened new strength. Through the longing for closeness to God, a new religious movement gained more and more followers: Hasidism. Soon there were men with long beards, kaftans and fur hats in every shtetl. They called themselves the Pious, the Hebrew word for which is Chassidut. Medjugorje in the Ukraine is an important place of pilgrimage for Hasidic Jews to this day. Here, the founder of the movement, Baal Shem Tov, lies buried. His message was simple and convincing.
The only way to give themselves a self-image of self-esteem is to show them that however small they are, with emotion and with love and with happiness, they can be Jews bigger than anybody else.
Baal Shem Tov said, "When the life of Jews is without joy, how is God supposed to remain with us? There, where there is only misery, God moves out." Hasidic Jews from the United States, Israel and Europe come together around his grave. They don't just want to give themselves to God in prayer, but also in their everyday lives. The whole life is a service to God and should therefore be filled with joy.
Here is my grandson from Israel. Here is my friend's son from London. And you see they both go with their, what we call their armor. They go and they show themselves, we are different from the general population. We want to keep ourselves separate. We are nice people. We interface with everybody politely, but nevertheless, distance. Because we want to keep our uniqueness where we are.
These days, New York is a center of the Hasidim. They maintain the tradition of their ancestors. Many are the descendants of Jewish immigrants from Russia. The closed world of the shtetl was breaking up. Some searched for support in their inner faith, others decided to flee from poverty and oppression. Like Mary Antin and her family, they wanted to risk a new beginning. Shipping agencies began advertising a new promised land across the Great Ocean, America. The father, Israel Antin, made the move there in order to build up a new existence for his family. Only then did he want to bring his family over. Mary had been waiting for this time for 3 years. Finally, her father sent the tickets for the crossing. A quiet and secret farewell had been planned, but the news spread quickly around the village. Mary and her mother were giving up their friendships, traditions, and their familiar world in the hope of exchanging them against freedom and prosperity. Just like the Antin family, 2 million Russian Jews left towards the end of the 19th century. They were part of a great wave of emigration, and they all had the same destination: America. The Statue of Liberty stood at the turning point between the nightmares of the past and the hope for a new world. After a 3-week journey, Mary, her mother and her sisters reached their destination. First stop was the Immigration Hall in Boston. Mary hadn't seen her father for 3 years. Would she recognize him? Before their reunion, the official asked scrutinizing questions. Were the new citizens healthy and able to work? Who was going to care for them? Many Jewish immigrants saw the new beginning as an opportunity to break with old traditions. America became the new center for Jews. Most immigrants settled in New York. The Lower East Side became their new home. Here they opened shops for kosher groceries and founded schools and synagogues. The American Constitution ensured them, like all human beings, unrestricted rights, irrespective of their beliefs. The immigrants came from villages in Eastern Europe into a modern metropolis. They had to get by on casual labor as day laborers, rag pickers and peddlers. They had no education or property and did not speak English. Most lived in so-called tenements, apartment blocks with small flats. Large families had to share a 2-room apartment. Many worked as tailors, a trade they'd learned in Russia. The work from home only earned them a few cents. Wages fell because the influx of cheap labor cut the prices. The Jewish women helped support their families and let go of their traditional roles. They fought in trade unions against bad working conditions. They wanted a better life for their children, education and a social climb out of the slums. Mary Antin's mother emancipated herself too. That was visible on the outside as well. She no longer wore her hair hidden under a headscarf, as was demanded of a Jewish woman by strict tradition.
What they created was an American Jewish culture, and it was different than the Jewish culture that had existed in Eastern Europe. It was different than the Jewish culture that Jewish immigrants developed in other places, England, France, Palestine, so that in each one of the places to which Jewish immigrants went, they created new cultural forms that fit the new place they went to. So they found ways to incorporate American words, American idioms, American realities into Jewish life.
For Mary Antin, the American dream came true as well. She went to college and became a journalist and author. She shaped her life and her world. The fate of the Jewish immigrants was both typical and unique. The descendants of Mary Antin live here in Lake Luzerne in the state of New York. They consider themselves American. Their faith is their business.
Father journeyed to America.
Mary Antin's great-granddaughter is a country music singer. She's written a song about the story of her great-grandmother. It's about the America of the Jewish immigrants. For her, it became the Promised Land.
Let freedom ring here in the Promised Land. World of hope where dreams take flight, and memory carries on the light.
Today, 6 million American Jews form the largest Jewish community outside of Israel.
Freedom is a precious thing.
For many devout Jews, there is only one promised land, Eretz Israel, the biblical land of their forefathers. The hope of a return has always stayed alive. During the 19th century, Jerusalem was under the rule of the Ottoman Turks. After Mount Zion, synonymous with the city and the country, the Jewish settlers called themselves Zionists. Many of them were intellectuals. They wanted to realize the new human in the Promised Land, so they said. Instead of studying the Bible, they rolled up their sleeves, dried out marshes and planted trees. For a long time, they hadn't been allowed to work on the fields. Spades and hoes now became the embodiment of a self-determined life. This man made a political program out of their vision and a uniform movement out of different groups. This man was Theodor Herzl. His parents were assimilated Jews from Budapest. Religion played next to no role. Theodor Herzl was working as a correspondent for the Wiener Freie Presse in Paris. France fascinated him, the country in which the Jews had enjoyed legal equality since the French Revolution. Many held important positions in the government and economy, but still there were deep-rooted prejudices against Jews in society. The drama in the military academy in Paris opened Herzl's eyes. In 1894, the Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was accused of alleged espionage for Germany. A military tribunal sentenced him to lifelong banishment without having sound proof. He was publicly cashiered. Again and again, Dreyfus swore his innocence. Many weren't interested in that. He was a Jew and therefore guilty. Even the serious press wrote, "Death to the Jew, death to the Judas." The trial split the country. Theodor Herzl observed the affair. Anti-Semitic outbreaks in an enlightened country, in the top levels of society in Europe on the brink of a new century. This was the crucial experience for him. In his newspaper articles, he pointed out the inconsistencies. He was convinced of the innocence of the Jewish officer. With this opinion, he was in the minority. The court documents of the affair are in the military archive in Paris. It was to take 12 years before Alfred Dreyfus was rehabilitated in a new trial. In 1906, the evidence that led to his conviction was exposed as forgeries. Theodor Herzl was right with his assumption. The Dreyfus affair was simply an expression of anti-Jewish sentiment in France. He was convinced that there was no safe place for Jews in Europe. Assimilate yourselves, then you'll do better, people called out to us with pathos, and we did. Except for our noses, we forgot our own customs and neglected our own culture. What good did it do us? In the eyes of the people, we remained Jews. And that doesn't just mean believers in the Jewish faith, but also sons of a different tribe. Only on their own soil could the Jewish people freely create its fate. Herzl wrote a book in which he outlined his vision. He called it The Jewish State. Just 1 year later, Herzl convenes a Jewish Congress in Basel. 200 men and women, selected delegates from 24 countries, respond to his invitation. Rabbis, students, merchants and professors, they decide to set up a program for the advancement of Jewish settlement and for the formation of a protected home in Eretz Israel. Herzl was convinced that Arabs and Jews could live there in peace together. And so Basel became an arena of world history. After the Congress, Theodor Herzl noted in his diary, "In Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say that out loud today, I would be met with universal laughter. But in 5 years, and definitely in 50, everyone will accept it." In a novel, The Old New Land, Herzl designed an image of a peaceful modern Jewish state. If you really want it, it won't be a fairy tale, but it's a long way from fairy tale to political reality. It took another half a century until the United Nations approved the creation of a Jewish state in a part of Palestine. On the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaims the founding of the State of Israel. The Star of David on a blue and white background, the symbol of the Zionists, became the flag of the Jewish nation. With the Declaration of Independence, a new era began in Jewish history, an era that has also been marked by wars. Herzl's dream of a peaceful coexistence of the cultures has not come true, but the Israel of today is a modern democracy as he defined it. All Jews, irrespective of their religious orientation, have ever since had the right to immigrate to Israel. In those days, just as today, far from all Jews shared Herzl's enthusiasm for their own state. The one direction is clearly the Orthodox side that says, of course, there's the idea that we should return to the land of our fathers. At Passover, when we say, next year in Jerusalem, that has a big impact. But that's not to do with nation states, that's to do with the Messiah. The idea that Herzl had there, they completely rejected. The other group was the one that is these days somewhat disrespectfully called the assimilated Jews. They're the people who've lived in these countries and said, we are Austrians, we are Germans, of Mosaic faith. And then someone comes along with the idea of the Jewish people. We had worked on being accepted here for such a long time, and then someone comes and says, no, it's all completely different, you're a people, and so now we'll make ourselves a state. And they said that that would damage their reputation and would cause a rise in anti-Semitism again.
Und es wird uns eigentlich wieder Antisemitismus einbringen.
In the Berlin of the turn of the century, many Jews looked optimistically to the future. The city was flourishing economically and culturally, a symbol of a new age, a modern age for Jews too. 2/3 of all German Jews were living on the banks of the Spree. The majority had become assimilated. Together with their Jewish dress, they also laid aside their strict rites and their Yiddish language. The Great Berlin Synagogue is an expression of the new self-confidence and a feeling of security. Now the synagogues lay on the main roads and, not like in the past, in hidden backyards. Everywhere in Germany, Jewish houses of worship were built in the late 19th century style. Most were destroyed in the Third Reich, but even in their restored splendor, they allow the imagination to see what German Jews once meant to Germany. It was in those days that Reformed Judaism arose, liberal and cosmopolitan. Men and women were now praying and singing together. The rabbi wore a black gown and preached in German. The feeling was no longer one of being a Jew in Germany, but that of being a German Jew. (1914), the outbreak of World War I. Karl Wolf, the son of a Jewish merchant, enlists voluntarily. This mission is linked with a special hope for him, as it is for many Jews. I go to war as a German so that I may protect my threatened fatherland, but also as a Jew so that I may fight for the complete equality of my fellow believers. Jews are important physicians, artists and business people, but access to the elites is not permitted them. 1.3 million Germans register for the general mobilization. Amongst them are 100,000 Jews. These are photographs of Karl Wolf taken during the war. He experienced camaraderie between Jewish and Christian soldiers. The fight against a common enemy united them. His photo album has survived the times. His son, Paul Wolf, managed to save it and take it to the United States. His father's hopes of recognition remained unfulfilled. While thousands are dying on the front, the Reich government carries out a census of the Jews that had enlisted. It is meant to expose the German Jews as shirkers. The statistics show the opposite, and for that reason it remains under lock and key. The medals for bravery are a weak consolation for the disappointment of the Jewish soldiers. Karl Wolf and many others felt betrayed by the country for which they had risked their lives. My father was, as far as I could tell from our discussion, felt mainly German at the beginning of World War I, much more German than Jewish. Powerful forces in German society did not accept this self-image. Caricatures on seaside postcards. Jews weren't wanted here, some beach pools advertised being Jew-free. The Jewish citizens were strangers in their own country. Anti-Jewish depictions in German everyday life were perfectly respectable. The more Jews assimilated, the more fervently many looked for new arguments to hate them. Anti-Jewish sentiment turned into anti-Semitism. They were not presented as a religious community anymore, but as an inferior race or foreign nation. Being a Jew became an inescapable fate. If one were to define anti-Semitism, I'd say that it's the idea that Jews were a tightly connected group with several negative characteristics that harm the societies in which they live for their personal benefit, and that they do this in secret. That's really important. They don't act openly. They can't be fought openly. Everything happens secretly, and the anti-Semite is just a person who exposes it. After World War I, Germany was in a sorry state. Injured national pride and an economic crisis provided fertile ground for radical groups. They put anti-Semitism on their agenda. A scapegoat was needed. The Jews were to blame for the lost war and were profiting from the Germans' suffering, it was said. In 1933, the National Socialists came to power. They began immediately to put their anti-Semitic program into effect. A boycott of all Jewish shops, racial laws, job prohibitions and dispossession.
Meine Herrschaften, hier ist Boykott in jüdischen Warenhäusern. Gehen Sie doch bitte weiter. Es sind sämtliche jüdische Geschäfte geschlossen.
By now, Karl Wolff was the father of 3 children. Like many Jews, he believed that National Socialism was merely a temporary phenomenon and that his children were safe in Germany. On November the 9th, 1938, reality catches up with the Wolff family too. The stormtroopers come to pick up Karl Wolff. Erika Wolff is home alone with her children. Her husband is visiting his brother-in-law. The brown shirts aren't interested in her husband's war decorations. His achievements provide no protection. Karl Wolff is found just a short while later and sent to a concentration camp. In that same night, synagogues all over Germany are set on fire. Jewish shops are plundered, 3,000 Jews are taken to camps and hundreds are murdered. When the SS came and picked him up in the Kristallnacht, he spent 3 weeks in prison, I think. He was let go because he had papers from World War I. But that was a wake-up call for him. He realised that he had to quickly collect his things and emigrate with his family.
Schnell meine Sachen zusammenhalten, dass ich auswandern kann mit der Familie.
In April 1939, the Nazis harassed the Wolff family for the last time. They want to make sure that the wealthy family aren't taking any valuables with them. But the Wolff family want just one thing: a safe life in the United States. There, an uncle had vouched for them. At this time, Paul Wolff was 9 years old. He had to watch how his parents' possessions were confiscated. Paul wanted to save at least something from his family's possessions. He decided to keep a crystal vase from the Nazis. Without the gold border, it looked worthless, so he hoped. These days, this vase has a place of honor in his living room in the United States. Six million Jews were brutally murdered, an incomprehensible number. 6 million destinies. The Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem commemorates the victims with photographs, personal mementos and letters. Yad Vashem means in English, memorial and a name, after the words of the prophet Isaiah. Unto them will I give in my house and within my walls a memorial and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off.
From last week, the fish place.
Paul Wolff, his parents and siblings all survived the Holocaust. These days he lives in California with his family. His father's dream of a liberal Judaism is something he passes on to his heirs. They are assimilated into society, but have also maintained their religious identity.
Go crazy trying to translate them into German.
Bet Israel, the house of Israel, is what the Bible calls the Jewish people. A house that has room for many persuasions and nationalities. The Jews' common inheritance unites them all over the world. In their rituals, the millennia-old tradition has been kept alive to this day.